Joseph Dietzgen. Scientific Socialism. First published, Volkshoheit, 1873. Source, Philosophical Essays, 1917. Scanned and marked up, Andy Blunden proofread, Andy Karloff, 2010. A considerable number of readers of the Volksstaat are opposed to elaborate and searching essays in these columns. I doubted therefore whether the following would be suitable for publication. Let the editor decide. Yes, I beg to consider whether it is not as valuable to engage the more advanced minds and to gain qualified thoroughgoing comrades as to strive for great numbers by publishing popular articles. Both these aims, I think, should be kept in view. If the party is really of opinion that the emancipation from misery cannot be accomplished by mending particular evils but by a fundamental revolution of society, it necessarily follows that an agitation on the surface is inadequate and that it is moreover our duty to undertake an inquiry into the very basis of social life. Let us now proceed. Contemporary socialism is communistic. Socialism and communism are now so near each other that there is hardly any difference between them. In the past they differed from each other as does liberalism from democracy, the latter being in both cases the consistent and radical application of the former. From all other political theories, communistic socialism is distinguished by its principle that the people can only be free when they free themselves from poverty, when their struggle for freedom is fought out on the social, i.e., on the economic, field. There is this difference between the modern and the older socialistic and communistic theories. In the past it was the feeling, the unconscious rebellion, against the unjust distribution of wealth, which constituted the basis of socialism. Today it is based on knowledge, on the clear recognition of our historic development. In the past socialists and communists were able only to find out the deficiencies and evils of existing society. Their schemes for social reconstruction were fantastic. Their views were evolved not from the world of realities, not from the concrete conditions surrounding them, but from their mental speculations, and were therefore whimsical and sentimental. Modern socialism, on the other hand, is scientific, just as scientists arrive at their generalizations not by mere speculation, but by observing the phenomena of the material world. So are the socialistic and communistic theories not idle schemes, but generalizations drawn from economic facts. We see for instance that the communistic mode of work is being more and more organized by the bourgeoisie itself. Only the distribution still proceeds on the old lines and the product is withheld from the people. The small production is disappearing while production on a large scale takes its place. Those are facts resulting from the economic development of history and not from any conspiracy of communistic socialists. If we define work as an industrial undertaking whose products the worker uses for his own consumption, and an industrial undertaking as the work, whose products go to the market, then it is not difficult to perceive how the development of industry must finally result in an organization of productive work. On the material organization of society scientific socialism is based. Scientific socialists apply the inductive method. They stick to facts. They live in the real world and not in the spiritualist regions of scholasticism. The society we are striving for differs from the present but by formal modifications. Indeed, the society of the future is contained in the present society as the young bird is in the egg. Modern socialism is as yet more of a scientific doctrine than of a political party creed, though we are also rapidly approaching this stage. And strange to say, the International is of purely national descent. It proceeds from the German philosophy. If there be a grain of truth in the prating of German science, then the scientific German can only be found in his philosophic speculation. This speculation is on the whole an adventurous journey, yet at the same time a voyage of discovery. As the clumsy musket of our forefathers represents a necessary stage to the Prussian needle gun of the present time, so the metaphysical speculations of a Leibniz, Kant, Fichte, Hegel are the inevitable paths leading up to the scientific proposition, that the idea, the conception, the logic, or the thinking are not the premise, but the result of material phenomena. The interminable discussions between idealism and materialism, between nominalists and spiritualists on the one hand, and the realists or sensualists on the other hand, as to whether the idea was produced by the world or the world by the idea, and which of the two was the cause or the effect. This discussion, I say, forms the essence of philosophy. Its mission was to solve the antithesis between thought and being, between the ideal and the material. A proof of this view I find in the Fortnightly Review on Zeit for the second half of January, 1873, in an essay on intoxicating articles of consumption, as wine, tobacco, coffee, brandy, opium, etc. The author, after having stated that the use of intoxicants was to be found among all nations at all times and under all conditions of human society, proceeds to declare that the cause of that fact must be looked for there, where the cause of all religion and philosophy lies, in the antithesis of our being, in the partly divine, partly animal nature of man. This antagonism between divinity and animality in human nature is, in other words, the antithesis between the ideal and the material. Religion and philosophy work towards a reconciliation of those conflicting principles. Philosophy proceeded from religion and began to rebel against its conception of life. In religion, the idea is the primary element which creates and regulates matter. Philosophy, the daughter of religion, naturally inherited a good deal of her mother's blood. She needed ages of growth to generate the anti-religious, scientific result, the apodictically safe proposition, that the world is not the attribute of spirit, but, on the contrary, that spirit, thought, idea is only one of the attributes of matter. Hegel, it is true, did not carry science to that height, yet so near was he to it that two of his followers, Feuerbach and Marx, scaled the summit. The clearing up of speculation helped Feuerbach to give us his wonderful analysis of religion, and enabled Marx to penetrate the deepest recesses of law, politics, and history. When we see, however, Herbart, Schopenhauer, Hartmann, etc., still going on speculating and philosophizing, we cannot regard them as more than stragglers, lost in the fantastic depth of their own thoughts, lagging behind in the backwoods and not knowing that the speculative fire has been overcome in the front. On the other hand, Marx, the leader of scientific socialism, is achieving splendid success by applying inductive logic to branches of knowledge which have hitherto been maltreated by speculation. As far back as the year 1620, Francis Bacon declared in his Novum Organon the inductive method as the savior from unfruitful scholasticism and as the rock on which modern science was to be built. Indeed, where we have to deal with concrete phenomena, or, as it were, with palpable things, the method of materialism has long since reigned supremely. Yet, it needed more than practical success, it needed the theoretical working out in all its details in order to completely rout its enemy, the scholastic speculation or deduction. In his famous History of Civilization in England, Thomas Buckle speaks at great length of the difference between the deductive and inductive mind, without, as it seems, having grasped the essence of the matter. He but proves what he admits himself in the introduction to his work, that, though having made German philosophy a serious study, he did not fully penetrate it. If this happens to ripe and ingenious scholarship, what shall become of immature and superficial general knowledge which deals not with specialties but with the general results of science? In order to indicate clearly the scientific basis of socialism, I venture to enter more fully into the general result of philosophy, into the solution of the antithesis between the deductive and inductive method. But I fear lest the result of metaphysics, so ostentatiously announced, may appear to the reader as somewhat insignificant and commonplace. I beg, therefore, to remind you of Columbus, who by means of an egg once for all furnished the proof that great discoveries resolve themselves into an ingenious, yet simple, idea. When we retire to the solitude of our cell to search there in deep contemplation, or, as it were, in the innermost of our brains, for the right way we want to follow the next morning, we must remember that our mental effort can be successful only because of our previous, if involuntary, experiences and adventures which we, by help of our memory, have taken along into our cell. That tells the whole story of philosophic speculation or deduction. These philosophers imagine they have drawn their theories, not from concrete material, but from the innermost of their brains, while, as a matter of fact, they have but performed an unconscious induction, a process of thought, of argument not without material, but with indefinite and therefore, confused material. Conversely, the inductive method is distinguished only by this, that its deduction is done consciously. Scientific laws are deductions drawn by human thinking from empiric material. The spiritist needs material just as the materialist needs spirit. This thesis, when brought out with mathematical precision, is the result of philosophic speculation. That may appear simple enough, yet even a cursory examination of any of our reviews will teach us how little familiar that truth is, not only to our journalists and writers but also to our historians and statesmen, who are untiring in their attempts to evolve views and theses not from the existing conditions but from their heads, hearts, consciences, categorical imperatives, or from some other unreal, mystical and spiritual corner. The concrete questions of the day are, as a rule, solved by, or with the help of, given material. But in the discussion with Bismarck whether might goes before right or conversely, in the squabbles of theology whether the gods are made by the world or the world by the gods, whether catechisms or natural sciences enlighten the mind, whether history moves upward to a higher stage or goes down to the day of judgment, in political and economic questions, whether capital or labor creates value, whether aristocracy or democracy is the right form of government, whether we have to work on conservative, liberal, or revolutionary lines, in short, in abstract categories, in matters of philosophy, religion, politics, and social life, our leaders of science find themselves in the most unscientific confusion. They test human institutions by such principles or ideas as the idea of justice, of liberty, of truth, etc. We, says Frederick Engels, describe things as they are. Proudhon, on the other hand, wants our present society to arrange itself, not according to the laws of its economic development, but in conformity with the precepts of justice. Proudhon is in this respect the prototype of all unscientific doctrinarism. A far superior guide in half such questions is modern socialism. Owing to its philosophical foundation, it stands out prominently as a unanimous, firm, and compact method amidst the endless and shifting dissensions of its political opponents of every shade and opinion. What the dogma is to the religious belief, material facts are to the science of inductive socialism, while the views of liberalism are as whimsical and elusive as the ideal conceptions, as the ideas of eternal justice or liberty on which the liberals believe to be safely based. The fundamental proposition of inductive socialism may be thus formulated: there is no eternal principle or an a priori idea of the divine, just and free, there is no revelation or a chosen people, but there are material factors which govern human society. Far from bewailing that fact, we acknowledge it as absolutely necessary and reasonable, as something which may be denied by power of imagination, but which cannot be altered, nor, indeed, ought it to be altered. By granting that society is dominated by material interests, we do not deny the power of the ideals of the heart, mind, science, and art. For we have no more to deal with the absolute antithesis between idealism and materialism, but with their higher synthesis, which has been found in the knowledge that the ideal depends on the material, that divine justice and liberty depend on the production and distribution of earthly goods. In the wide range of human needs, the bodily ones are the most indispensable. Our physical needs must first be satisfied before we are able even to think of our mental ones and those of our heart, eye, and ear. The same holds good in the life of nations and parties. Their abstract conceptions depend on the way they make their living. Tribes living by warfare and booty have not the same heaven, the same sense of justice or of liberty as our patriarchs are supposed to have had, who, as is well known, were living on cattle breeding. Knights and monks had notions of righteousness, of virtue and honor which were decidedly illiberal and anti-bourgeois, because their means of life were not supplied by factory labor and financial transactions. Of course, the defenders of Christianity strongly object to those views. In order to prove the independence of spirit from matter and of philosophy from economics, they make the assertion that the same Christian truth is invariably taught to all sorts and conditions of men and under all climes. They forget, however, how they trimmed the sails to the wind. They forget likewise that the love preached by the apostles and church fathers, the love which gave away the second coat, is no more the many-coated love under the overcoat which strips the poor to the skin, of course, rightfully. To the diverse modes of property and trade correspond diverse Christianities. The institution of slavery in USA was Christian, and Christianity was slave-holding there. The religious reformation of the 16th century was not the cause, but the effect, of the social reformation that followed upon the shifting of the economic center from the manor to the city. And that was preceded by the rise of navigation and the discovery of the New World and new trade routes, which indicate the rise of manufacture. Industrial life, having no use for ascetic bodies, introduced the Protestant doctrine of grace that abolished religious exercises in favor of stern industrial work. That the materialist conception of history is scientific induction and not idle speculation manifests itself even more clearly when we apply it to political party problems. With its help, the tangled mass of party struggles can be easily unraveled into a clear, running thread. The squire is enthusiastic over the absolute monarchy as the absolute monarchy cared for the Squire Archie. Manufacturers, merchants, bankers, in short, capitalists, liberal or constitutional, for constitutionalism is the call expression of capitalism, which liberalizes bad trade commerce, supplies the factories with free labor, promotes banking and financial transactions, and, in general, of the interests of industrial life. Philistines, small tradesmen, and peasants join party or the other according to the promises made with regard to the promotion of their well-being and to the relief from the effects of competition with big capital. The familiar accusation of political hypocrisy which parliamentary parties throw at each other was suggested to Bismarck by one of the renegades of our camp whom he likes to employ. That accusation is based on the recognition that the aristocratic and middle-class consciousness was formed by the material requirements of the landed and manufacturing and trading classes, and that behind their idealistic watchwords of religion, patriotism, freedom, and progress lurks the concrete interest as the motor power. I cannot deny that many of their followers are not conscious of their real motives, and that they sincerely believe their political work to be purely idealistic. But I should like to remark that it is with recognitions as with epidemics, they are in the air and people feel them somehow. Indeed, the political hypocrisy of our time is half conscious, half unconscious. There are many people who take the ideological phrases as gospel truth, but also the artful are by no means rare who want them to be taken as such. The matter can be easily explained. Different classes, distinguished by their different material conditions, succeed each other to political power. The interests of the ruling class are always for a certain time in harmony with the interests of the community, that is, with the progressive forces of civilization. And it is that harmony which justifies the ruling class in regarding itself as the spring of social welfare. However, the onward march of history changes everything, also the justification for ruling power. When the economic interests of the ruling class cease to be in harmony with the general welfare, when the ruling class loses its functions and falls into decay, then its leaders can only save their predominant position by hypocrisy. Their phraseology has been emptied of all reality. It is no doubt true that some individuals rise above class interests and join the new social power which represents the interest of the community. So did Abbé Sieyès and Count de Mirabeau in the French Revolution, who, though belonging to the ruling classes, became the advocates of the Third Estate. Still, these are exceptions, proving only the inductive rule that, in social as in natural science, the material precedes the ideal. It may appear rather contradictory to make the Hegelian system of philosophy with its pronounced idealism the starting point of the materialist conception of history, yet, the Hegelian idea is striving for realization. It is indeed a materialism in disguise. Conversely, the Hegelian reality appears in the mask of the idea, or of the logical conception. In one of the latest issues of Blätter für Unterhaltung, Herr J. Folkelt makes the following remark: our modern thinkers have to submit to the crucial test of empiricism. The Hegelian principle has no reason to be afraid of such a test. Consistently followed up, it means that the spirit of history can only be conceived through the existing material. Gleams of truth like these we can find now here and there in the periodical literature, but for a consistent and systematic application of the theory we must to scientific socialism. The inductive method draws its mental conclusion from concrete facts. Scientific socialism considers our views dependent upon our material needs, and our political standpoint dependent upon the economic position of the class we belong to. Moreover, this conception corresponds with the aspirations of the masses whose needs are in the first place material, while the ruling class must necessarily base itself on the deductive principle, on the preconceived unscientific notion that the spiritual salvation and the mental training of the masses are to precede the solution of the social question. Joseph Dietzgen 1877. The Limits of Cognition. Source: Joseph Dietzgen, Philosophical Essays, Charles Kerr & Co., Chicago 1906, pages 224 to 235. First published, in Vorwärts, 1877. Translated, by M. Beer and Th. Rothstein, edited by Eugene Dietzgen and Joseph Dietzgen Jr. Transcribed, by Ida O'Callaghan for the Marxists Internet Archive. Proofread, Andy Karloff, 2010. An anonymous letter touching the above subject, written evidently by an expert, has recently been received by the Vorwärts, which in an unbiased manner attempts to show that philosophy and social democracy are two things apart and that, therefore, one may very well belong to our party without adhering to the social democratic philosophy. Hence it is concluded that the central organ of the party was wrong in allowing philosophic discussion to become a party matter. The editor of the Vorwärts has been good enough to show me that letter as it referred to my articles. Though the author has given clearly to understand that he had no wish to provoke by his protest any public controversy, since, as he maintains, newspaper controversies did not admit of a thorough treatment of the subject, nevertheless I hope he will not find it indiscreet if his objections are used here for the purpose of elucidating a question which both to him and to myself and, to judge from the general interest displayed at present with regard to it, appears to be of great importance to our whole generation. And as regards thoroughness, it seems to me that voluminous books are no better qualified for it than newspaper articles. On the contrary, there has been of late so much long-winded twaddle that a great portion of the public is losing all taste for the discussion of such matters. First of all, I should like to contradict the statement that philosophy and social democracy were two things apart which had nothing between them in common. Quite true, one may be an efficient member of the party and at the same time a critical philosopher, or even a Christian. The human soul is such a queer thing that it can easily find some sort of conciliation between the various contradictions. And not only in things philosophical and religious, but also in things economical, a great measure of heresy is permitted. We must in practice be tolerant to the extreme, and surely no social democrat would ever think of putting any party member into the straitjacket of uniformity. Nevertheless, theoretical uniformity must be demanded of all who devote themselves to scientific investigation. Theoretical uniformity, systematic homogeneity is the consummation to be desired as well as the advantage of all science. That social democracy is scientific and science is social democratic will, I hope, be granted by my esteemed opponent. Of course, there are many branches of science which bear less on the socialistic aspirations to emancipate enslaved humanity. But the philosophical question, the question whether there is beyond and above the world anything metaphysical, anything higher, which it would be too monstrous for our intellect to attempt to conceive, or which is beyond a human understanding to explain, this special question of philosophy about the limits of cognition bears very closely upon the slavery of the people. Social democracy does not seek to establish eternal laws, permanent institutions, or unchangeable forms, it seeks in general the salvation of mankind. The indispensable means toward attaining that object is mental enlightenment. The question whether the instrument of cognition is a narrow makeshift, that is an inferior one, whether scientific research supplies us with true ideas, with truth in its highest form and last instance, or merely with poor substitutes which have above them the inconceivable, this problem of the theory of cognition is eminently a socialist problem. All the ruling powers which have exploited the people have to this very day appealed for justification to a higher destiny, to the grace of God, to the holy ointment, to the metaphysical incense. And if they also referred to enlightenment, religious freedom, political progress, and critical philosophy, they knew very well that without something higher, something inconceivable, something metaphysical, be it even a mere moral world, the reins will break which keep the people straight and the ruling classes in wealth and dignity. But let there be no misunderstanding. Not that the social democracy are against the moral world. We, too, desire to arrange the world morally, but we desire this arrangement to emanate from the many below, and not from the few above, that is, we desire to arrange it ourselves. We, therefore, need no chimeras, no limits of cognition to effect and to keep up such an arrangement. It is, on the contrary, preeminently the business of social democracy to make it clear to the perverted world that the individual intellect is a poor instrument in comparison with the fathomless problem of science, so that the individual must circumscribe his efforts within definite limits, but that, on the other hand, the faculty of cognition of the human race is as full of possibilities, as limitless, as fathomless as the problem which nature sets before it for solution. The doctrine of mental poverty, the doctrine of the limited understanding of man, is the last remnant of the religious humbug. Those who, on the basis of the social democratic program, strive to emancipate the working class through the workers themselves, must entirely divest themselves of all the foolish expectations and hopes and philosophical hair-splitting and speculation in so far as it all relates to another world. This other world is now an exploded notion with science and scientific circles. There is only that portion of it left which deals with the limits of cognition, and as long as these are supposed to exist, there is still a higher limitless cognition standing behind, and there is also the inconceivable, and nobody who has before his eyes that phantom will ever arrive at a proper appreciation of, and confidence in, human energy and responsibility. To transform radically the present immoral world, an energetic consciousness of the unlimited faculty of cognition of the human mind is required. This makes it imperative that we should place all talk of the possibility of a higher cognition in the same category where the bodies of the saints stand who, indeed, have stomachs, but need no food, no drink. If another sort of cognition is possible than the one which is commonly called so, then, of course, flesh and blood are possible, too, which look, taste and are constituted like flour and water. In short, we ought, then, to become Catholics, and seek our salvation in prayer and not in active work. We must then give up social democracy. Our anonymous comrade is of a different opinion. He wants to take up the cudgels in behalf of something inconceivable, in behalf of a limited human cognition, and yet is not willing to stop and keep to those limits. Those who really believe that there is something inconceivable must and will keep away from it with their conception and not try to penetrate further and inquire, else they treat the supernatural as if it were natural, and the inconceivable as if it were merely not yet conceived. An equation like this, our opponent thinks, is merely an external one, the contradiction only a superficial one, since it indicates only that the human mind, which involuntarily affects that equation, is reluctant to admit the existence of the inconceivable and, therefore, pronounces it merely to be not yet conceived. If it did do that, if, on the contrary, it were to accept that there really is something inconceivable, which to it is like a sealed book, then under such an acquiescence all incentive towards inquiry would be lost and there would no longer be any science. From this it follows that man has two minds, one which must needs have something inconceivable, and another which must needs inquire into it. As against that I hold that the time has arrived when the human mind must be taught that the inconceivable is not a subject for science and that scientific inquiry has more than enough food in the domain of things yet to be conceived. This, says our opponent, is really nothing but the old controversy over again about the limits of human cognition, a controversy which your correspondent has presented in a way of his own with which I am not quite in sympathy. Let us see, then, he continues, whether our professors of philosophy have really treated this point so badly as to deserve a curt dismissal. The one who first carried out the investigation into the limits of cognition was Kant. However, he did not proceed beyond the categories of understanding, and had in his practical reason to assume hypotheses which gave his system a contradictory character. It was, however, this circumstance in his system which, although the limits of formal cognition had been defined sharply enough, made further progress a necessity. And what else was it than the endeavor to conceive the inconceivable, that is to solve the inner contradiction of thinking? Fichte it was who attempted the solution, etc. Then it was Hegel who came nearer to the inconceivable by a far greater step by demonstrating, etc. He showed that, in order to understand the world reason, it is only necessary to understand our own reason. This, it is patent, brought the inconceivable appreciably nearer to us. And when we thus consider to what an extent those three philosophers have advanced our scientific understanding by attempting to conceive the inconceivable, we must take some care not to condemn the official philosophy and to give her notice to quit. The reply of the social democratic philosophy is as follows: it never thought of refusing the philosophers of the past what is historically due to them. On the contrary, it starts from the premises that Kant, Fichte, and Hegel have transformed the inconceivable into the conceivable to such an extent that the time has at last arrived when we can give all metaphysics with its official philosophers notice to quit, and also all those thinkers who fail to recognize this important achievement and do not cease making an inconceivable of everything which is not yet conceived. The critique of pure reason, the history of science, the logic, or the theory of cognition has in its development advanced so far that now social democracy has a clear knowledge of what is meant by to know, and we may well speak with derision of those learned Capucines who place above the knowledge of nature something higher still. Kant is said to have sharply enough defined the limits of formal cognition. This is precisely what we dispute with all our might, the point that separates radically the social democratic philosophy from the official. Kant has not sharply enough defined the limits of formal cognition because, with his famous thing in itself, he still left the belief in another, a higher cognition, in a superhuman monster mind. Formal cognition is knowledge of nature. The philosophers may sigh for another sort of knowledge, but they are, before all, bound to give us some indication where it is to be found and how it is constituted. Of the real cognition, the one which is in daily use, they speak contemptuously like the ancient Christians spoke of the weak flesh. The actual world is for them only an appearance and its essence a mystery. Long after this rotten phrase has become discredited in other branches of science, the fraud is still being perpetrated in the theory of cognition. Nobody will have any other sort of tin than natural tin. Why should it be different with knowledge? If natural science is content everywhere with the phenomenon, why not with the phenomenology of mind? Behind the limits of formal cognition there always hovers the higher, unlimited metaphysical mind, behind the official philosopher, the theologian, and behind both of them, the inconceivable. And when Hegel showed that, in order to understand the mind of the world it is only necessary to understand our own mind, we declare ourselves perfectly in agreement. Only the social democracy would correct the mystical expression, we know only one mind, the human mind is the mind of the world. But what is this inconceivable, asks the author of the letter to the Vorwärts. When we are forced to acknowledge that every scientific attempt to conceive it brings us appreciably nearer to it, are we not bound at the same time to believe that it will eventually become the conceived? Then we should have the demand of your correspondent fulfilled, not, indeed, in his way, but in that of official philosophy. To this, too, the official philosopher has his reply, namely, that being as in a state of absolute rest, can by no means be resolved into the absolute movement of thinking. This dictum, says our opponent, defines at once the limits of knowledge, that is, the inconceivable. Does it follow, then, that we must deny its existence, and that we must keep away from it? Surely not. Every scientific attempt to approach it, to conceive it, or even to formulate the problem of it, leads us nearer to the obscure point and throws new light on it, though it may never bring us to an absolutely clear vision of it. And the pursuit of this object is the business of philosophy, in contradistinction to natural science, which only deals with facts and explains phenomena. Phenomena? Of course. Thus the subject of philosophy, the inconceivable, is a kind of a bird from which we can now and then pluck out a feather or two, but are unable to strip it to the skin, and which must forever remain inconceivable. If we examine closely the feathers which the philosophers of the past have already plucked, we recognize by them the sort of the bird, it is the human mind. And here we are again at the decisive point which separates the dialectic materialists from the pure idealists. Mind is to us a phenomenon of nature, while nature is to them a phenomenon of mind. If it only stopped there. But no, there lurks in the background a malicious intention to promote mind to an entity, a thing of a higher descent, and to reduce everything else to a platitude. We are, therefore, bound to call attention to the fact, well known as it is to the world at large, that not only mind, consciousness, or apperception, but all things are in the last resort inconceivable. We are unable to conceive the atoms, and we cannot explain out of the atoms and their movement the slightest phenomenon of consciousness, says Lang in his History of Materialism, and another writer also says, the nature of matter is absolutely inconceivable. And yet we continue to inquire into their nature, because of our need of causation, or, as it is also called, impulse towards research, which, in its irrepressible way, cannot help plucking feathers even from the inconceivable. As against this we say, that which allows of being possibly conceived is not inconceivable. Whoever wants to conceive what he considers inconceivable, cannot be taken seriously. Just as with my eye I can only perceive the visible, with my ear hear only the audible, so with my faculty of conception I can only conceive the conceivable. And when the social democratic philosophy teaches that everything which exists can be perfectly conceived, it does not thereby deny the inconceivable in a natural sense. We admit the same as the naturally invisible for our eyes, we only object to that double-dealing, shuffling philosophical sense which makes the inconceivable again conceivable on a higher plane. We are earnest about this question. We know of no higher and other cognition than the ordinary human one. We know positively that our understanding is truly called understanding, and there can as much or little be any other and essentially different understanding as square circles. We place the intellect among the ordinary things which cannot change their nature without changing their names. The social democratic philosophy agrees with the official one that being can by no means be resolved into thinking, not even a particle of it. But neither do we regard it as the task of thinking to resolve being, but merely to arrange, to order it formally in classes, to explain its rules and to find its laws, in short to arrive at what is called knowledge of nature. Everything is conceivable in so far as it can be classified, everything is inconceivable in so far as it cannot be entirely reduced to thought. This we cannot, must not and have no wish to do, and therefore we keep away from it. But we can very well do the reverse, namely, to reduce thinking to being, i.e., to classify the faculty of thinking as one of the numerous modes of existence. My opponent appeals to the fact that Kant, Fichte, and Hegel have come nearer to the inconceivable by a few steps. But what those philosophers have grasped was nothing inconceivable, but merely the conceivable portion of the intellect or the formal cognition. We only go a little step further and conceive the intellect as totally a formal instrument which can only perform in the theory of cognition what it practices in natural science. With us science is a homogeneous species of which philosophy and knowledge of nature are varieties, both observe given facts or explain phenomena. We find intellect to be as much empirical as matter. Thinking and being, subject and object exist in the domain of experience. To characterize one of these natural objects as absolute rest and the other as absolute motion is, since natural science has reduced everything to motion, no more permissible. What our comrade said of the inconceivable, namely, that every scientific attempt leads us a step nearer to the obscure point, though we can never gain an absolutely clear vision of it, is also true, without mystification, of every object of natural science, of the inconceived. Also knowledge of nature has its unlimited objective. Even without mystic limits we approach the obscure point ever nearer and nearer without ever bringing it within full vision. That means simply that science, like nature, has no limits. Granted, however, that impulse towards inquiry is inherent in man. It cannot be denied that, in order to use this impulse rationally, one must properly understand it. The rational impulse towards inquiry tends to a certain systematic arrangement of existence, i.e., to find out the laws of existence. If it exhibits the tendency to go beyond existence, it must go beyond itself, beyond all nature. With such aspirations philosophy necessarily overshoots itself and falls into extravagance which it inherited from religion. Philosophy and religion miss the final causes of all conceivableness, namely, the empirical, the fact. Our thoughts should be based on sense perceptions, on experiences. Those who, on the contrary, wish to base fact on mind or logic must understand this merely in a formal sense. The last cause why the stone falls or heat expands is the fact, and the law of gravitation and the law of expansion are abstractions or formal reasons. Not only can being not be resolved into thinking, but even the philosophic aspiration to do so is a pure ideological overstraining. Just as man is possessed by the impulse to know everything, so he possesses also the impulse to see everything. Well, here is a pane of glass which is quite transparent. Yet it is not all transparent. Its specific gravity or degree of solidity cannot be seen, its quality to emit a sound can only be heard, etc. Precisely the same with the organ of knowledge. We are able to know everything completely, yet along with this everything is something more than knowable, and this fact that being cannot be resolved into thinking can be a matter of lamentation only to the fantastic dreamer. If we could know of any one thing absolutely everything, then knowledge would be all and the object nothing. Knowledge and nothing left to know. Light and nothing left to see. Then it would be like of yore when nothing was, and the earth was without form, and void.